name is Professor Ian Williamson, and I am the Dean of the Pomerantz School of Business here at the University of California, Irvine. Welcome to another episode of the Dean's Thought Leader Series. Today we have with us Mashika Allgood, who is an AI ethicist, as well as the founder of Ally Consulting. Ally Consulting provides educational services around artificial intelligence to individuals who both have a very strong technology orientation as well as to non-tech individuals in industry. I think that Ms. Allgood is uniquely qualified to provide this service, having both a law degree as well as a Juris Doctorate, and having worked in artificial intelligence, most recently in the domain of working with NVIDIA. Mashika, thank you very much for taking the time to join us today. I look forward to speaking with you.
I'm glad to be here, Dean. I appreciate being invited.
So I have to ask, and many of the individuals who are watching this will have the question: AI ethicists. What do they do? What is that? Explain that to us.
Yeah. So first, it's not really a job. So let's put that out on the table. It's a bit more of a calling. It's I kind of There's a part that's kind of a canary in the coal mine. A lot of people got into it because, in the work that they were doing, they saw negativity and concerns that they wanted to address, and it cost them, a lot of whistleblowers and people who left their companies because of, their ethical values. It cost them. But it's really more of a kind of an alarm, that we're trying to sound, that the world keeps snoozing to some degree. But it's the idea that we don't really know this technology in the way that you would think we do, given the way that we've allowed it to proliferate within the world. And so I think the role of AI ethicists is kind of like a temporary thing. It's, the world's, first effort to understand where we are in this situation. But I think the goal over time is that this role goes the same way of like chief safety officer, right? Unless you're in certain industries, that role has been subsumed into other parts of the organization. So I think right now there's a big clamoring for a chief ethics officer, and it's because the knowledge isn't there within the industry and within, your organizations. But ethics is something just like safety that will proliferate all areas of your business practice. And so then it'll be less of an issue of a single person and more of an issue of, this becoming an institutionalized kind of mentality and framework.
So there's a period of time where we have to actually upskill the organizations with these capabilities, and then hopefully that becomes to permeate through all the relevant job functions as opposed to be a siloed activity over to the side, really becomes part of the way we think about this more broadly.
Exactly. That's the hope.
That's the hope. Were there specific incidents or maybe specific examples of cases that you saw, maybe that were publicly, public, that really motivated you to focus more on this in your career? Were there some trigger points or examples that you point to that goes, that's a good example of why this is the type of conversation we need to have more prominently in organizations?
So when I worked at NVIDIA, I was not working in AI at all. I was a product manager on a infrastructure. So enterprise software licensing, right? So an infrastructure product. But I just happened to pick up a book on Claude Shannon about information theory and then started thinking about, well, everything can't be transmitted, right? Because information theory is what you can transmit and how to transmit that information. But certain things like, the way you feel, the feeling in the pit of your stomach when your mother says your name in that particular way when you know you're going to get it, you can't really transmit that, right? And so that was initially what I was thinking, just theory. And then I started researching, well, how does this play in the law? And then I found out about the COMPAS algorithm. And clearly, the legal system had absolutely no idea about, the kind of metrics they were using and why they were using these particular metrics and whether they were fit for a legal construction when that case went up to the Supreme Court.
And maybe provide a little bit of detail about that case to some of our listeners.
So the COMPAS case, the COMPAS algorithm is a predictive algorithm that's intended to determine whether someone is at risk of being a recidivist, so going back to jail. And so initially it was being used in parole decisions. So should I grant this person parole? Are they high risk, for coming back to jail? Then it became used in sentencing. And so there was a lawsuit saying, I don't know this algorithm. I don't know what it means. Like, I can't query it. So it shouldn't be allowed to be used. And so it went all the way up to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court was like, well, how about we put some warning labels on it? The judges don't know what to do. But that shows a lack of understanding of human interaction with technology and how humans just generally default to the technology being right, even if they strongly believe it's wrong. Like they'll strongly have opinions that I don't think this is right, but they don't want to overrule the technology. And so it was just a lack of understanding of how AI works itself, like what the technology that was being used, and then its role in society. So that was my initial thing. And then I started thinking about, well, tech or AI, gathers data and then tries to generalize across populations. Well, what if I'm gathering data in California on language? And then I decide to take that and use it in a 911 application, like a triage application in the South. It's not going to have any understanding of the kinds of the kinds of accents that we have across the South. And so that can be catastrophic. And so that really was the example that got me thinking while I was at NVIDIA and got me to form this AI ethics work group within NVIDIA, so that we could start looking at some of our applications internally. That 911 wasn't one, it was just an example I came up with. But looking at some of our internal applications and what we were helping people create within the world and trying to figure out how we could make some strides towards explaining ethical AI and helping people understand how to build in a more ethical way.
And are there particular spaces as we think about certainly all indications are that the application of artificial intelligence will grow in a wide variety of spaces? And are there particular spaces or applications or domains where you think there's a bigger need for us to prioritize the ethical aspects of this than others, especially if you think about over the next 5 years or so?
So I'm going to start with, I don't think your initial point is necessarily true. So there's this inevitability narrative that we hear about AI. Like it's here, it's always going to be here, it's going to continue growing. But if you look back on the history of AI, that's not what we've seen. AI has been a boom and bust. They call it AI winter that happens every 10 or 15 years, right? It's been a boom or bust cycle ever since it initially, came to being. And what's kind of funny is the boom or bust, AI tends to boom in the dark and it busts in the light. Right? So if you look at the initial, Semiotics was like the initial AI company in the US, and it got massive funding doing all kinds of shady-ish kinds of things with the DoD and different corporations. But as soon as light got turned on and they could prove that it could do what it said it could do, all of the funding dried up. And so we've been in that kind of situation. And so when I look at the future of AI in 5 years, I think it depends on business leaders. When you look at how the technology works, it is by nature exploitative, right? And so it's kind of colonialist in that we mine data, a natural resource, from individuals, right? And we create value higher up the chain and provide little to no value from the people who we took the data from, right? But there's a movement now on data sovereignty, right? And so this idea of tech companies hoovering up all the data, keeping it in their data centers and using it, to create products as they will, that may not actually exist in 5 years if the data sovereignty movement gets moving. Then you have to look at the idea of the second part of colonialism, which is AI forces the beliefs and behaviors of the majority on the minority, right? Because AI is a generalizable system. It doesn't try to figure out, well, what do these people do and what do those people do? I'm looking for the biggest pattern and I'm trying to work within that pattern. If you're not in my system and I can't find a pattern for you, I mean, good luck with that, right? And so, that whole process is now you've got this moving towards transparency and explainability. Can I see how the AI is making the decisions when it comes to individual people, right? Fairness and equity. All of that movement is against this whole idea of just generalization from these small corporations. So not small, this small group of corporations. So depending on where that goes in the next 5 years, that completely changes the landscape. The only reason big tech is because they have all the data
Hmm.
and because they create products that they scale. It's all about scaling around the world. Well, if they're now being held responsible for scale, so in the case of, let's say, Facebook, I think 2 days ago, a lawsuit, $150 billion lawsuit was filed by on behalf of the Rohingya Muslims in Myanmar because Facebook was fomenting violence there and weren't putting the resources in order to fix that. So this irresponsibility of scale,
Hmm.
people are pushing back on, and so that significantly changes, the outlook. And then, we've got this issue of antitrust, right? And people trying to break up these big companies because, there is no competition, when you've got 4 or 5 companies running everything. So if the antitrust movement continues, to gather steam, then that changes the landscape. So I don't know that we're in a position to see AI as inevitable in the workplace. I think AI will become a tool, like every other tool we have in business, and it will be more useful for certain kinds of business and less useful for other kinds of business. It will be more dangerous to use in certain business activities and less dangerous to use in other business activities. I just think right now we've been in this free for all and people are just throwing whatever against the wall. And if it sticks, it scales, right? And so, in that kind of environment, there's this mentality that the money's never going to dry up, but the money has consistently dried up for AI. And so, I think business leaders need to be aware of that and be paying attention to all these counter movements, to what which are counter to what we're hearing from the technology companies and, their disciples today.
Hmm. So in your discussion, it struck me that part of the response to the activity that you're describing, these counter movements perhaps, somewhere in there is a notion of a regulatory framework of some sort. And that might be both from a government perspective, which brings with it civil and criminal clauses, but it also could be industry level, which is more voluntary, that is generated by industry itself. And it'd be helpful if you can maybe describe, I know you have been involved in some of the broader international activities around shaping or thinking through regulatory frameworks around this. Maybe give maybe a little bit of background of the types of organizations you've been involved in and have been leading around that space, and then what you think the role of regulation should be going forward.
So I've been involved with largely with the IEEE, which is basically the largest engineering society. And we're more creating standards and regulations.
Yes.
I'm currently involved in educational standards, both K through 12, both for engineering and non-engineers. People who work within the sphere of AI. And I'm also involved in an effort around creating standards for AI procurement. So to help nation states, government entities figure out how do I procure AI in a responsible way. So there are a lot of movements around regulation around the world. I think, there's always a pushback when it comes to regulation because people feel like regulation stifles creativity. But I don't think that bears out in the data. So I was watching a Discovery Channel thing on Titans Who Built America, and they talked about Heinz. And at the time when he was coming out with his ketchup, it became really popular. And so then other people started creating adulterated versions that had like sawdust and all kinds of crazy stuff in it. You could die from buying ketchup. And he realized that his positive innovation was being stifled by bad actors. And so he actually pushed for the creation of the Food and Drug Administration. Basically, people who would make sure that if I said this was a food, there was food in it and only food in it, right? Someone has to set the floor. Somebody has to set the rules so that true innovators can innovate within those rules. And then the best products win. But right now, what we have is there are no rules. And so people are creating things that are not even AI, but they call it AI. Something like 80%, there was a, they did an audit of, I'm not gonna call out the state, they did an audit of a state on all the AI systems they had purchased, and 70 to 80% of them had no AI in them at all, right? So people are just hoovering up money under the guise of AI. And so you have to have regulation so that people who are legitimately doing this and innovating in the space can win, so that the best products can be competitive. Right now, competition is, you've got the big tech giants, and then you've got a whole lot of crazy. So there are some good things in there, but they're getting lost in the shuffle because there's just so many people taking advantage of a lack of regulation. So I think regulation is absolutely necessary. I think getting it right is difficult, not because we don't know how to regulate, but because people don't understand the limitations of the technology. And there's such a disconnect between what we're getting from the tech community and what we're getting from ethicists and people who are looking at it in reality, that it's just very difficult for people to navigate within that space.
So you mentioned you're working on standards, particularly in the education space. Can you give some examples of the types of standards that you're thinking about or you're working to develop?
So we're looking at, it's early going,
Yeah.
but we're looking at what kind of information is necessary. So the thing about the IEEE is it is a large and unwieldy type of situation. So anything we do takes years, right? But there are several standards that have come out around just general, design practices and things of that nature. So we, as a standard body within our little education group, just now came to the agreement that we can't just educate engineers, that we have to start lower in the pipeline, so K through 12. We have to have some consideration for people who are going to go to trade schools or not going to go to college at all. And then we have to educate the people who work with engineers, because the engineers can't do it alone. That's as far as we've gotten with IEEE. We're working though. As part of my company, we're putting out a series of courses. AI for legal professionals is where we're starting. And the first course comes out in January. But for my purposes, I feel like the space around education in AI is either highly technical or not technical at all. And so it's like, I'm going to give you everything you need, which I don't want that. Or I'm just going to give you the broad strokes, which means I have to believe you. But no one's giving me the information I need in order to make my own judgments about the technology. And so for me, it was very important to create um, a program or create educational materials that are techie to a degree, right? That explain the different components of AI, that explain, what are these fairness factors that people are looking at? What is accuracy? Like, what are these charts they keep showing me that I don't understand, right? So I don't need to know how to code, but I need to know how to understand the output. And how does the output happen? And where does that come from? So for me, I think the important thing is to make sure that you're giving some technical ability along with what you're telling them about what the tech can do, so that people can come to their own judgments and be capable of looking at the technology on their own and making decisions about uh, if it will work or if it's fit for the purposes for which they desire.
So that's a great segue to the next question I was going to ask you. Many of the people who will be watching this would be, say, students, potentially investors, and I think they would be intrigued by this idea or this technology, may not be experts in it. What advice would you have for them in terms of how they can best prepare themselves to have their appropriate level of discernment as they make decisions about their careers, if they're managers leading in spaces, if they're investors looking at organizations? What advice would you have them for what they should be thinking about and how they can prepare themselves personally to make good judgment in those spaces?
So I think the first thing you need to recognize is there are different roles within the business organization, and they all have different purposes, right? If you are really trying to invest and understand the technology, you shouldn't be talking to the salespeople.
Hmm.
Let them get you to the table. But I worked in a large organization, and I know that sales has very different things that they need to do as opposed to what I had to do as a product manager, right? And so there's oftentimes a disconnect between what the technology is capable of and what we really want it to do, right? You need to be speaking to the people who understand the limitations. So I'm talking to product managers, I'm talking to engineering leads. It is painful, I know, to get into that techie speak. But if you're trying to put a career or some money, a massive investment then you're going to have to do what you have to do. So, uh, short example, the Elizabeth Holmes story. Her name is Elizabeth, I believe.
Yes.
Yes, the Elizabeth Holmes story. When you see the people who are coming across on the stand who invested, they talked to her. They went with her to the labs. They always had her on their arm while they're talking to the people who work at the company. Well, who's going to say what the tech can and can't do when the CEO is standing right next to you, right? So we have to be comfortable digging deeper in. And if the CEO is not comfortable with you doing that, it's a red flag. So
Mm.
that's what I say for an investor. When you're talking to students, I think curiosity is of extreme importance. You have to be willing to look at things besides, just business impact, because business impact is not going to be enough anymore, right? So you're going to have to be comfortable looking at societal impact. Well, how do you get there? Have you ever taken a philosophy course? Do you know anything about sociology? Have you looked at politics or art? Like, you have to be able to expand your horizons so you have a broader view of the world and a framework outside of shareholder value, that can help you drive decision making. Because a lot of this pushback that we're seeing, the way it's manifesting itself is that we've been pushing towards shareholder value almost exclusively, and the world is pushing back against that. And so I think the business leaders who will be successful going forward are business leaders who can show societal impact and business impact, and not just don't be evil, and not just we're bringing the world together while people are, clearly going to war, but legitimately show, not just say, business impact as well as societal impact. So I think technical skills also are going to be key. You don't have to be able to code, but if you were doing MySpace, in middle school, and you learned a little bit about HTML and CSS, I got into actual tech, with HTML and CSS, writing web pages. That's how I learned, basic coding and how this stuff kind of works out. So you have to start somewhere.
Mm.
That's probably the easiest of the languages. It's not even considered a language, but it's the easiest of the languages to understand. But I spend a lot of time reading articles, watching videos. There's a guy, Robert Miles, who speaks about high level AI, kind of AI agents and things of that nature that I found massively helpful. But it's really about just expanding your world. When you see something that's techie, just dive in a little bit. But as a student, I would really suggest getting out of just the business school and taking a class here or there and something to try to broaden your horizons.
Sounds great advice. Mashika, thank you very much for sharing your experiences, your insight. I think you provide a really a very holistic framework for us to be considering what is clearly a tool that will be in our future. But as you pointed out, that future has not yet been determined, and a lot of our actions about how we engage with this tool will shape what that looks like. And it's very good to see that you, through the work that you're doing through your business, and also some of the work you're doing through the professional bodies, will help guide some of that activity. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.